Charlotte stood at the kitchen table, staring out the open window. The blue evening shadows fell on her face, emphasizing every wrinkle, every emotion that had left a mark on her face over the years. Her fingers, accustomed to work, slid across the surface of the table, nervously drumming on the smooth wood. She did not know that the days ahead would see this calmness disappear, giving way to chaos. "Mom, can you hear me?" The voice of Lisa, her daughter, broke the silence that hung over the kitchen. Lisa had just come home from work, her bright voice contrasting with Charlotte's depressing thoughts. Charlotte flinched slightly, looking away from the window. She needed to focus on the present. "Yes, dear. I'm sorry, I was thinking," she replied, trying to keep her tone calm. Lisa was inspired. Her face shone with joy and excitement, the kind of emotions young women feel when their lives seem to be going so well. She jumped up to her mother, hugging her by the shoulders. "Trevor invited us to dinner again. I'm so glad you two finally met and got along. He is so wonderful, isn't he?" Charlotte smiled, although she felt something else inside. Tension, doubt, mixed with a tinge of guilt. Trevor. His name alone evoked different feelings in her that she couldn't even admit to herself. His presence evoked emotions she hadn't felt in a long time, and it was dangerous. "Yes, he's really wonderful," Charlotte replied, trying to hide her anxiety behind her usual caring smile. Trevor was a man who had captivated not only her daughter but many women around him. Tall, slender, with light golden hair and penetrating eyes, he seemed to be the embodiment of success. He knew how to tell a story, so that everyone listened with rapt attention, and he always knew what to say to make people feel comfortable around him. But Charlotte noticed something that others may not have noticed. Beneath his impeccable appearance was a man who knew how to manipulate people and build connections for his own benefit. Their first meeting was no accident. Lisa brought Trevor home for dinner a few months ago. Charlotte remembered sitting at the same kitchen table and watching her daughter beam with happiness next to this man. Trevor made a great impression on her. He was polite, friendly, almost flawless. But something in his eyes then alarmed Charlotte. His gaze sometimes lingered on her a little longer than on others. From then on, their paths began to cross more and more often, and each time they met, it added even more tension. Charlotte tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, that she was getting older and perhaps feeling something that didn't really matter. But the feeling of anxiety did not go away. Lisa continued to talk about wedding plans, but Charlotte could no longer concentrate on her daughter's words. Her thoughts wandered in a different direction. She remembered her last evening with Trevor when he unexpectedly offered to drive her home after a night at work. Lisa had stayed with her friends that night, and Charlotte, though hesitant, had agreed. Trevor was as polite as ever, but their conversation felt different. He was closer. His words sounded deeper. He said that he admired her strength, that he respected the way she had raised Lisa. And although his words were meant as a compliment, Charlotte felt that some invisible thread had formed between them that she could not break. "You're always so serious," Trevor said in a soft voice, looking at her with eyes that seemed a little too attentive. Charlotte felt a little uneasy but couldn't tear her gaze away. "I'm just tired," she replied, trying to restrain herself. But Trevor didn't back down. "You deserve better than that. You're always thinking about Lisa, but when do you think about yourself?" His words cut through her defenses. Charlotte knew it was a game, but she felt herself gradually succumbing to it. Her loneliness, which had been accumulating for years, made her vulnerable to such manipulation. "Trevor, I think you should go back to Lisa." She tried to stop the conversation. "What if we just stayed here a little longer?" His voice sounded quiet but insistent. It wasn't a question, it was an offer that was hard to refuse. Charlotte then stood up and, without looking at him, said, "This is not right." She knew that if she stayed even a minute longer, everything would change. Her life, her relationship with her daughter, everything she had built over the years. But thoughts of that night never left her. She often caught herself thinking about him more than she should. Every time they met with Lisa for family dinners or evenings, this invisible bond between her and Trevor grew stronger. "Mom, are you sure you're okay?" Lisa's voice came again. bringing Charlotte out of her thoughts. "Yeah, I'm sorry, it's just been a long day." Charlotte quickly turned to her daughter and added, "Trevor is a really great choice for you." Lisa did not notice the struggle that was going on in her mother's mind. She was immersed in her future with Trevor, planning a life together, a wedding, houses, dreams. But Charlotte knew that this was not just an infatuation. She was on the verge of an unavoidable disaster. The next few weeks were an ordeal for Charlotte. Every time she looked at Lisa, who was glowing with happiness, she was painfully reminded of what she herself was deprived of. Lisa was passionate about the wedding preparations. Every little thing seemed important to her, from choosing napkins to determining the menu. She spent hours discussing all of this with Trevor, and for Charlotte, these moments seemed unreal. If anyone knew what was going on behind the scenes, Lisa's happiness would immediately shatter into thousands of small pieces. Charlotte tried to avoid thinking about Trevor. She focused on her work, tried to distract herself with other things. But still, every call from Lisa, every mention of her fiancé emphasized the irreversibility of events. Trevor continued to look for excuses to meet. Each meeting was calculated and almost random. Dinners with Lisa, which sometimes ended with them being alone for a few minutes. Meetings after work, when Trevor would show up completely unexpectedly. Her heart beat faster every time they were alone. The feeling of danger, tension, and pleasure at the same time became an integral part of these moments. Every glance they made, every casual touch was like a challenge to fate. And the more Charlotte tried to fight herself, the stronger her emotions became. One day, after a long day at work, Charlotte came home later than usual. All her thoughts were occupied with reports that needed to be completed, and suddenly she found Trevor at her doorstep. "What are you doing here?" Charlotte was surprised to see him. Her voice was tinged with anxiety, but her eyes were full of hidden curiosity. "I just decided to take a walk. I saw that you weren't home yet and thought maybe I could give you a ride," Trevor replied, his smile carefree, almost friendly. But there was something more in his eyes. Charlotte felt her heart start to beat faster. Her mind told her that this was not just a chance meeting, but she decided to go along with his offer. "Okay, then let's walk," she said, trying to keep her cool. They walked through the quiet streets, and the air between them was tense. Charlotte could feel this moment approaching a point from which there was no return. Her thoughts were mixed. She tried to find reasons to stop it, but every look he gave her, every word he said, drew her in more and more. "How are you even coping with all this?" asked Trevor, leaning slightly toward her. "I know you work hard, and you're always there for Lisa. She is very grateful to you, you know?" "Lisa is my life," Charlotte replied, but her voice trembled. She could not admit even to herself that these words no longer had the same power as before. "You're a wonderful mother," Trevor said so softly that the words penetrated deep into her heart. He leaned closer, and Charlotte felt his warmth. She knew that he was deliberately approaching her, that it was all part of his game, but she couldn't find the strength to pull away. "Trevor," she tried to start, but she couldn't continue. Her voice was almost inaudible. He stopped and looked her straight in the eye. Their faces were so close that she could feel his every breath. His eyes shone with some unusual power, and Charlotte realized that it was becoming increasingly difficult to resist him. "Charlotte, we both know this isn't easy," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. He touched her hand, and it felt both forbidden and like something she had been waiting for. Charlotte could not speak. All the words were stuck somewhere in her throat. She felt like this moment she had been trying to avoid had finally arrived. She could have left. She could have pulled her hand away from his and run home. But she didn't. His lips touched hers, and in that moment, everything disappeared. All her fears, doubts, guilt, all of it dissolved in their kiss. Her world was turned upside down. She knew it was wrong, that she was betraying her daughter, betraying her own moral principles. But at that moment, it didn't matter. They stood in the middle of the night, far from the gaze of others, but close to the abyss that separated her from reality. Her heart was beating in unison with his, and it seemed that this moment could last forever. When the kiss ended, Charlotte took a step back. Her breathing was labored, and her heart was beating so hard that she seemed about to faint. She looked at Trevor, and there was more than just desire in her eyes. There was something more, something dangerous. "This is wrong," she finally managed to say, her voice almost pleading. "Why is it wrong? We both feel it," he replied, and there was so much confidence in his voice that Charlotte almost gave in again. "Because you are my daughter's fiancé," she said, looking away. She knew this was the last line of defense she could not afford to cross. "But we can't just ignore what's between us," Trevor continued, taking a step toward her. "We can do it discreetly. No one will know. It won't affect Lisa, I promise." Charlotte looked at him, and her heart was breaking. She knew Trevor wasn't telling the truth. She knew that sooner or later it would all come out. But could she stop now? I don't know," she whispered, her voice full of doubt. She could not make a decision. She was trapped in a trap of her own making. Trevor took another step toward her and gently took her hand. "You don't have to make a decision now. Just let it happen," he said, and his voice sounded so calm, so convincing, that Charlotte felt her last vestiges of resistance disappear. They spent that night together. Charlotte knew that she had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. She had betrayed not only her daughter, but herself. But at that moment, it didn't matter anymore. The next morning, everything was as if nothing had happened. Charlotte returned to her normal life, trying to hide what had happened. But every time she looked at Lisa, her heart broke with guilt. She didn't know how long she could keep this secret. But she knew one thing. Sooner or later, it would all end in disaster. The weeks after that night were an endless series of trials for Charlotte. She woke up thinking about Trevor and fell asleep with the same anxiety. He was everywhere in her thoughts, in Lisa's conversations, in her heart. The guilt and fear grew every day, but she continued to play her part. Lisa suspected nothing and seemed to be happy as she prepared for the wedding. One evening, Lisa suggested having dinner in a small circle, as they usually did, her, Trevor, and Charlotte. Charlotte knew that every such evening made her nervous, but she couldn't refuse. She realized that any attempt to avoid Trevor would arouse her daughter's suspicions. Dinner was held at Lisa's house, where everything was decorated in warm, cozy colors that emphasized her happy state. She chatted carefree, talking animatedly about the last preparations for the wedding, and Trevor, as always, supported her in everything. But Charlotte could feel the tension between her and Trevor becoming unbearable. She also invited her father to dinner, who said he didn't have time to come. "Mom, you're so quiet tonight," Lisa said to Charlotte, sounding slightly worried. "You know it's very important to us that you are happy at our wedding." Charlotte looked up, trying to hide her true feelings. "I'm fine, darling. Just a little tired," she replied, forcing a smile. Trevor, sitting next to Lisa, looked calmly at Charlotte. His gaze was as piercing as ever, but now she saw something more in it, coldness, perhaps even indifference. It seemed even more dangerous than their previous connection. She knew that Trevor was no longer trying to hide his dominance over the situation. He was confident in himself, and that he could control everything that happened between them. After dinner, Lisa suddenly received a call from a friend and decided to go out for a while to talk. "Excuse me for just a minute," she said, leaving Trevor and Charlotte alone in the room. Charlotte remained standing by the table, unable to meet Trevor's eyes. She felt like he was trying to get her attention again, but this time she wasn't going to give in. Her heart was beating wildly, and all her instincts were screaming, "Run away!" "Do you still think you can just stop all this?" His voice came, low and intense. Trevor got up from the table and walked closer to her. Charlotte felt her body stiffen with fear. "Trevor, we have to stop this. This is not right. Lisa doesn't deserve this," she said, trying to keep her cool. "Don't talk to me about Lisa." He stepped even closer, his eyes glittering with dark determination. "What we have is much more important than what she thinks, and you know it." Charlotte felt her defense mechanisms breaking down. She could no longer listen to these words, which made her feel disgustingly guilty. "No, you're wrong. I will not be a part of this anymore," she said, with all the determination she could muster. Trevor suddenly grabbed her arm, his touch hard and painful. "You don't understand, Charlotte. We've gone too far. You can't just walk away anymore." Charlotte wrenched her hand from his grip and took a few steps back. Her body tensed, and she could no longer contain the fear that had taken over her. "You're wrong. It's over." But Trevor didn't stop. He took a step toward her, his face full of anger. "I'm not going to let you throw me away like that," he said, his voice rising a half tone and a dangerous spark in his eyes. Suddenly a sound came from the street. Someone was coming back into the house. Charlotte felt her heart sink. She turned her head toward the door, expecting Lisa to enter the room any moment. But instead, the room remained silent, and the tension grew with each passing second. And then something happened that Charlotte did not expect at all. A quick stab of a knife broke the silence. Charlotte instinctively stepped back, and Trevor suddenly froze in place, his face changing dramatically. He grabbed his chest, trying to understand what was happening. His hand touched his body, and Charlotte saw blood on his fingers. Trevor staggered and fell to the floor. His eyes were wide with shock, and he couldn't say a word. Charlotte froze in place, her body not listening. Everything happened so fast that she couldn't understand where the knife came from or who struck the fatal blow. Trevor was dying right in front of her. A feeling of panic gripped her from head to toe. Her breathing became labored and ragged, but she could not move. She looked at Trevor's body lying motionless on the floor, and her mind couldn't comprehend what had just happened. What could she do to change this situation? The killer had fled the house. Charlotte was looking at the crime scene in horror when the door suddenly opened, and Lisa entered the room. "What happened?" she exclaimed, seeing Trevor lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Charlotte could not answer. She just stood there, stunned and confused, her brain trying to put the pieces of what had just happened together. When the detectives arrived at the scene, it was too late. The light of police lights broke the darkness, creating an eerie atmosphere around the house. Inside, tension reigned. Lisa was almost in a state of shock, sitting on the couch and looking somewhere in front of her, and Charlotte stood next to her, arms crossed, unable to take her eyes off the place where Trevor's body had recently been lying. The detectives leading the investigation were experienced professionals who had seen many similar situations, but something about this case made them wary. Trevor's death didn't look like an ordinary random murder. Too many details didn't add up, and their intuition told them that there was something much more complicated than just a violent attack. Detective Michael Rainey, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a calm gaze, looked over the crime scene, assessing every element of the room. His partner, Detective Sarah Green, a young and energetic woman with a sharp mind and a keen eye, examined the evidence, trying to spot anything out of the ordinary. "The murder happened quickly," Michael said, looking at the pool of blood that had already begun to harden on the floor. "But there's something strange here. It looks too clean." Sarah nodded. "I agree. There are no signs of a struggle, no signs of an attack. It looks like Trevor didn't see it coming, but why would someone kill him so quickly and efficiently?" They both looked at Trevor's body, which had already been taken away by the forensic team. They knew that many questions would need to be answered to solve this case, and most of those answers were likely to be hidden in the room itself. After the crime scene was thoroughly examined, the detectives decided to conduct the first interviews. Lisa and Charlotte were the main witnesses, and they started with them. Sarah sat down next to Lisa, trying to calm her down with her calm and polite tone. "Lisa, please tell us what exactly happened that evening." Lisa, still holding herself together, took a deep breath. Her voice sounded shaky. "We were having dinner together as usual. I received a call from a friend, so I left the room. I must have been gone for only a few minutes, and when I came back, Trevor was already lying on the floor, dead." Sarah wrote down everything without interrupting Lisa. Michael stood by, watching Lisa's every reaction. Her shock was obvious, but he wondered if she was hiding something. "Did you see anyone when you left the room? Was there anything out of the ordinary?" asked Sarah. Lisa shook her head in the negative. "No, nothing. Everything looked normal. I didn't even hear any noise or screaming." Michael noticed how Lisa clenched her hands tightly into a fist. It was a subconscious but important observation. She was not just upset, She was confused. Meanwhile, Charlotte was being interrogated by Michael in the next room. Her face was tense, and her eyes seemed frozen in time. "Mrs. Bennet, can you tell us exactly what happened tonight? Any details could be important," Michael began. Charlotte sighed heavily. "We were having dinner together as usual. Lisa went to talk on the phone. Trevor stayed with me for a few minutes. We barely spoke, and then I didn't hear anything either. I just saw his body. It all happened so fast." Michael noticed one important detail in her response. Charlotte mentioned that they hardly spoke. This meant that there were still some words between them, even if they were short. "What exactly did he say to you?" Michael asked. Charlotte thought for a moment, and her eyes grew heavy. "He said that it couldn't be over, that he wouldn't give up." Her voice trembled as she said it. Michael wrote that phrase down, realizing it could be the key. It sounded like there had been a conflict between Trevor and Charlotte, but it wasn't detailed enough to draw conclusions. After the interviews were completed, the detectives decided to take another look at the evidence. They suspected that seemingly insignificant details could play an important role. Sarah began to examine the knives in the kitchen. They were ordinary kitchen tools, but one of them was missing. "Michael, one of the knives is missing," she said, looking closely at the knife block. Michael walked over and leaned toward her, examining the knives. "This could be the one that killed Trevor," he said. "We should check to see if there are any fingerprints." Sarah nodded and called in the technicians for further examination, but she already had a feeling that the knife was only part of the puzzle. The next day, the detectives continued to investigate other details. They found Trevor's notes, where he made notes about financial plans, but one of the notes caught their attention. On one of the sheets was a bank account number that could not be found in any of Trevor's official documents. "What kind of account is this?" asked Sarah, showing Michael what she had found. "It looks like it's something hidden. Maybe Trevor was doing some other business that no one knew about," Michael suggested. "We should check out this account. Maybe it will lead us to the answer to why he was killed." At the same time, the technicians completed the examination of the kitchen knives and told the detectives important news. Fingerprints were found on the missing knife. The prints belonged to Charlotte. "That doesn't prove anything yet," Sarah said, as she and Michael reviewed the report. "She could have taken it while cooking." "Yes, but it's still an important detail," Michael replied. "We may be dealing with a family quarrel that ended tragically." The detectives decided to continue their investigation, trying not to rule out any leads. They knew that small details could provide answers to the most important questions. As the detectives continued to look for clues, Sarah noticed another seemingly insignificant detail. While examining the room, she found a small gold earring on the floor. It was neither Lisa's nor Charlotte's. The two women wore completely different jewelry. "Whose earring is this?" asked Sarah, showing it to Michael. "It might belong to one of the guests, but we have to check it out," Michael replied. "This detail might be more important than it seems." They decided to send the earring for examination to see if it could have had anything to do with the evening of the murder. A week passed, and the investigation was moving closer to new discoveries. The detectives continued to collect evidence, but felt that they were close to solving the case. Fingerprints on the knife, Trevor's bank account, and the earring found at the crime scene. All these details were gradually coming together. When experts confirmed that the earring belonged to one of Trevor's girlfriends, it was another twist in the case. Now the detectives had another possible witness or suspect. "Michael, I think we're close to a solution," Sarah said as they reviewed the new evidence together. Details that seemed insignificant turned out to be extremely important. Michael nodded, and they both realized that the most important discovery was yet to come. Detectives Michael Rainey and Sarah Green were standing in front of the door of the apartment where the owner of the earring, Carla Jenkins, lived. She was one of Trevor's girlfriends, and although her presence at the crime scene was not recorded, the earring found in Lisa's living room clearly indicated that she had been there that evening. Michael knocked on the door, and a few seconds later it was opened by Carla, a tall young woman with short dark hair and a tense expression. She didn't seem surprised at all by the police visit. "Carla Jenkins?" asked Michael. "Yes, that's me. What's this about?" Her voice was tense, but she tried to look calm. We're here to ask you some questions about the murder of Trevor Williams. May I ask when you last saw him? Michael asked calmly, looking at her carefully. Carla flinched at the mention of Trevor's name, but quickly regained her composure. Trevor was my friend. I haven't seen him in weeks. Why are you asking me? Sarah, standing next to her, showed her the earring. We found it at the crime scene. Can you explain how your earring ended up in the house of Lisa, Trevor's fiancé, the night he was killed? Carla thought for a moment, then sighed softly. Yes, that's my earring. I was there a few days ago. Lisa invited me for coffee and we talked about the wedding. Maybe I lost it then. But I swear I wasn't there the night he was killed. Why did you hide this information? Why didn't you admit right away that you were at their house? Sarah questioned, her gaze growing more intense. Carla pressed her lips together as if she was considering whether to speak. After a few seconds of silence, she finally spoke. Okay. Trevor and I were more than just friends. We dated for a few months behind Lisa's back. But I stopped seeing him when I realized he was playing both of us. I didn't realize he was so insensitive. Michael and Sarah exchanged glances. This information came as a surprise, but it only added to the complexity of the picture. You're saying you never saw him again? Michael clarified. But did you know that someone else was involved with Trevor? Carla looked at them nervously, and then suddenly said quietly, I think he was seeing someone else. I suspected it wasn't just me and Lisa. Once he said there was another woman he really liked, but he didn't say her name. I thought it was another one of his affairs. Sarah leaned into Michael and whispered, This could be important. Maybe we don't know everything yet. Do you have any idea who it could be? Asked Sarah, looking at Carla. Carla thought for a moment and then answered quietly, I'm not sure, but I saw him looking at Charlotte, Lisa's mom. It was strange, but I didn't think much of it. Michael and Sarah exchanged glances. The information that Trevor had been having an affair with Charlotte confirmed their earlier suspicions. It could explain the tension between them that night. Thank you, Carla. We may still have some questions for you later, Michael said, and they left the apartment. Back at the station, Michael and Sarah reviewed all the information they had. The fact that Trevor was having an affair with Charlotte complicated the picture considerably. But now they needed to find proof that this was what led to his murder. We need to talk to Charlotte again, Michael said, looking at his notes intently. They went to Charlotte's house. When she answered the door, her face was tense, but she tried to stay calm. They invited her to a short conversation in the living room. Mrs. Bennett, we have new evidence that suggests you may have had a personal relationship with Trevor, Sarah began, not taking her eyes off Charlotte. Charlotte flinched, but did not deny it. She sat down in a chair and put her hands in her lap, nervously twiddling her thumbs. Yes, it's true. We had an affair, but it's over, she admitted, her voice trembling. Why didn't you tell me this before? Asked Michael, trying to understand her motives. I was afraid, Charlotte whispered. I was afraid it would ruin everything. My life, my relationship with Lisa. Trevor was a dangerous man. He wouldn't let me go. I thought that if I kept it a secret, things would calm down over time. Sarah looked at Charlotte, and while her confession was important, it didn't prove that she had killed Trevor. Did he threaten you? She asked. Charlotte nodded. He said that if I tried to leave him, he would tell Lisa everything. He knew how to manipulate people. Michael rubbed his chin thoughtfully. But could you have killed him to protect yourself? Charlotte raised her head and looked them straight in the eye. Her gaze was full of pain, but she also looked confident. No, I did not kill him. Yes, I was afraid, but I couldn't do it. After questioning Charlotte, the detectives returned to the station with more information, but still had no solid proof. They decided to look at the surveillance footage from the surrounding streets to see who might have been in the area of Lisa's house on the night of the murder. And then they came across something unexpected. One of the neighbors had a camera that showed someone entering Lisa's house a few minutes before the murder. It was David, Charlotte's ex-husband and Lisa's father, whom no one had seen for several years. When detectives found David, he looked tired and exhausted. His life after his divorce from Charlotte had not been going well, and he was living on the edge of survival. At first glance, it seemed that he had no reason to kill Trevor, but the detectives knew that there could be ulterior motives. During the interrogation, David initially denied any involvement, but after several questions, he confessed. He had heard about Trevor's affair with Charlotte, and when he heard that, he grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed Trevor's body with all his might. His anger was not only because Trevor had ruined his ex-wife's life, but also because he had manipulated their daughter, Lisa. "I couldn't stand it," David said, his voice bitter. "He ruined everything he touched. I just wanted to stop him." The motive became clear. David acted out of jealousy and a desire to protect his family, even if it meant killing. Now the detectives knew the truth, and the killer was found. When it was all over, Michael and Sarah returned to the station feeling a mixture of emotions. They had solved the crime, but the story behind it was tragic for everyone involved. From infidelity to cruelty, this story will leave its mark on the lives of all those involved. "Sometimes even the smallest details can reveal the whole truth," Michael said as he looked out the window at the sunset. Sarah nodded. She knew that this incident would forever stay with them as a reminder that human motives are sometimes more complex than they appear at first glance. After David's confession, everything finally fell into place. The detectives had gathered evidence to prove his guilt, and now the case was going to trial. Trevor's murder was explained as an act of desperation on the part of a man who had lost everything that was important to him. David acted out of his resentment and anger directed at Trevor, who had entered his family and torn it apart. But, as often happens in such situations, there were actually more victims than just one person. In Charlotte's house, silence reigned, so oppressive and heavy that it seemed to fill every corner. Lisa was sitting on the couch, her gaze directed somewhere far away beyond this space. She already knew the truth that her father had killed her fiancé, that Trevor had cheated on her with his own mother. Her world, once so clear and simple, was now in ruins. Charlotte stood by the window watching the children play in the street. She could not find the words to ease Lisa's pain. All she could do was be there for her. Her heart was breaking with guilt because she knew she was part of this tragedy, even if she didn't want to be. Her affair with Trevor, her inability to stop, had led to the destruction of their family. "Mom, why did you do it?" Lisa asked quietly, not turning her head. Charlotte was silent. Her mind tried to find an answer, but there were no words. How could she explain something that was never supposed to happen? She knew that she had betrayed her daughter, and she knew that an apology would not be enough to fix what had happened. I was weak," Charlotte finally said. "I couldn't stop myself. I didn't think about the consequences. I regret it every day." Lisa sat in silence, her gaze unmoved. She did not know if she could forgive her mother. They had been close all their lives, and this betrayal was the biggest wound. "I don't know how to go on," Lisa said quietly, finally looking up at her mother. Charlotte sat down next to her, trying to take her hand. "I don't know either, dear, but I'm willing to try, if you'll let me." Lisa looked at her mother, and for a moment there was something that looked like hope in her eyes. They were both victims of this tragedy. Both had lost everything they held dear. But perhaps it was not too late to try to rebuild their lives from scratch. When David was arrested, he did not resist. He seemed calm and detached, as if he had already accepted his fate. He had no regrets or remorse, only a deep emptiness inside. He knew that he was trying to do what he thought was right, but in the end he only added more suffering to an already broken family. In court, David pleaded guilty. His sentence was harsh, but fair. Lisa did not attend the court hearing. She could not bear to look at her father, knowing that he was the cause of all this misery. A few months after the trial, Charlotte and Lisa began trying to rebuild their lives. They moved out of the city, leaving behind all the memories that had drawn them to the past. It was a new beginning, albeit a difficult one. One evening, sitting on the veranda of their new home, Lisa spoke softly. "Mom, I don't know if I can ever forgive you completely, but I'm willing to try." Charlotte hugged her, tears welling up in her eyes. But this time they were tears of relief. They both knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but this was a step in the right direction. Michael and Sarah closed the case of Trevor Williams's murder, but they could not forget about this story for a long time. They knew that sometimes even the most perfect plan falls apart due to human emotions, jealousy, fear, and the desire to protect loved ones. This case was more complicated than it seemed at first glance, Michael said, looking at the pictures taken at the crime scene. Yes, but in the end it all came down to human emotions. Jealousy, betrayal, fear. It's always more difficult when such feelings interfere with the case, Sarah replied, sighing. But at least we found the truth. Michael put down the papers and looked at her. Sometimes that's all we can do. Sarah nodded. The story was over, but it had left its mark on their lives, as well as on the lives of those involved in the drama. Leaving a dark and difficult period of their lives behind them, Charlotte and Lisa knew they still had a long road to recovery. But they also knew that together they could overcome anything. Although the past would never completely disappear, they now had a chance for a new beginning.